They said it was untouchable. They said it could withstand weeks of bombardment, months of siege, and generations of enemies. They said this fortress was not just stone and steel, but an idea, the physical proof that defense, preparation, and engineering could freeze the chaos of war. And for a long time, they were right. No army had ever taken it by force. No assault had ever come close. But history has a habit of humiliating certainty. What makes a fortress feel invincible is not just its walls. It is the stories told about it, the calculations repeated in war rooms, the maps marked with thick red lines that say, "Here, the enemy stops." This fort sat at the center of those assumptions. Its angles were perfect. Its fields of fire overlapped with mathematical precision. Every approach route was exposed. Every weakness had been reinforced, redesigned, corrected. Engineers had obsessed over it. Generals trusted it. Politicians slept well because of it. The defenders believed time was on their side. That belief shaped every decision they made. Supplies were stocked for long resistance. Troops rotated calmly. Training focused on endurance, not surprise. The fortress had survived previous wars, previous technologies, previous enemies who had tried and failed. Each failed attempt only reinforced the myth. If it hadn't fallen before, it wouldn't fall now. But war does not evolve politely. It does not announce when the rules have changed. While the defenders studied old victories, the world outside the walls was moving faster than their doctrine. New ways of thinking were spreading quietly through enemy ranks. New calculations replaced old ones. And most dangerously of all, someone began to ask a forbidden question. What if the fortress didn't need to be captured at all? That question never reached the inside of the fort. Inside, confidence was thick. Officers walked the ramparts, believing they were standing inside history itself. Soldiers joked that the enemy would break long before the walls did. Reports that hinted at unusual enemy preparations were dismissed as exaggerations. After all, every enemy prepares. Every enemy plans. And every enemy eventually realizes the same thing. You cannot break a fortress built like this. What no one inside the walls truly considered was speed. They imagined attack as something gradual. Artillery first, probing assaults, attrition, negotiation, exhaustion. They imagined days turning into weeks, weeks into months. They did not imagine minutes. They did not imagine absence. They did not imagine waking up inside a stronghold designed to endure, only to realize that endurance would never be tested. The psychology of defense is deceptive. The stronger the walls, the weaker the imagination becomes. Adaptation feels unnecessary when protection feels absolute. Innovation feels risky when tradition has worked before. And so the fortress became a monument not just to strength, but to assumption. Every stone reinforced the same idea. The enemy must play by our rules. But the enemy was no longer interested in rules. Somewhere beyond the horizon, calculations were being made that did not include breaching walls or storming gates. Someone was measuring not thickness, but timing, not resistance, but reaction. And while the defenders rehearsed how long they could hold, the attackers focused on how fast everything could end. This is the moment history often hides from us. The calm before a collapse so sudden it rewrites doctrine overnight. The fortress still stood. The flags still flew. The defenders still believed. And that belief, more than any structural flaw, was about to become the most dangerous vulnerability of all. Before we go any further, Pause for a second and think about this. How many times in history did absolute confidence become the real weakness? That question is at the heart of this story. If you're starting to realize that wars are often lost long before the first shot is fired, you're already seeing what most commanders inside that fortress never did. If this perspective is changing the way you look at military history, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell me what you think makes defenses truly fail. Technology, mindset, leadership, or Chimi itself. Writing it down forces you to engage with the idea, and engagement is how real understanding begins. If this story is holding your attention so far, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that deep, carefully told military history still matters, and it helps this channel keep uncovering moments where certainty collapses without warning. And if you want to follow more stories like this, moments where strategy, innovation, and human error collide, subscribe to the channel now. You don't want to miss what happens next, because we're about to move from belief to impact, from theory to action. The problem was not arrogance, it was familiarity. The defenders did not believe they were invincible because they were careless. They believed it because every prior calculation supported that belief. The fort had been analyzed, reinforced, simulated, and re-simulated across multiple generations of military thinking. Its designers had studied siege warfare, artillery trajectories, infantry assault patterns, even early air attack scenarios. On paper, there was no realistic path to collapse. And that was exactly the mistake. When defenses are evaluated only through the lens of past threats, they slowly become blind to future ones. Inside the fortress, readiness reports were excellent. Structural integrity was rated high. Ammunition reserves exceeded minimum requirements. Morale was stable. From a command perspective, nothing was wrong. In fact, everything looked reassuringly normal, and normality is dangerous in a world where warfare evolves faster than bureaucracy. Intelligence officers did receive warnings. Some reports hinted at unusual enemy activity, reduced artillery positioning, fewer reconnaissance probes, strange silence where pressure was expected. These signs were filed, acknowledged, and then rationalized away. The assumption was simple and deadly. If the enemy was not attacking, they must be unprepared. No one seriously considered that the enemy might be preparing to attack in a way that rendered the fortress irrelevant. This is where doctrine quietly fails. Military doctrine is built to standardize response, to reduce chaos, to make war manageable. But doctrine also teaches commanders what not to look for. It creates blind spots. Inside the fort, officers were trained to expect escalation, not disappearance. They expected pressure to build, not vanish. So when nothing happened, they relaxed, not because they were foolish, but because their training told them nothing else made sense. The defenders trusted the fort more than they trusted uncertainty. That trust shaped their posture. Patrols became routine. Alert levels softened. Drills were conducted mechanically rather than urgently. Even contingency planning assumed prolonged engagement. Everything revolved around resistance over time. No one asked what would happen if time stopped mattering. And psychologically, that confidence spread downward. Soldiers internalized the belief that their job was to endure, not adapt. They joked about how long they could hold out. They speculated about relief forces weeks away. The fortress was no longer just a defensive structure. It became a promise, a guarantee that whatever happened outside, inside would remain stable. This mindset produced a fatal delay. When early indicators of something different began to surface subtle vibrations, odd acoustic signatures, unexplained shifts. They were dismissed as environmental noise or equipment error. After all, the fortress had sensors, backups, redundancies. It was built to absorb anomalies. Nothing about these signals fit the expected pattern of attack, so they were not treated as threats. History shows this pattern repeatedly. Strong defenses do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they are optimized for the wrong problem. The more perfect the solution to yesterday's war, the more fragile it becomes against tomorrow's ideas. Inside the fort, leadership believed they were guarding space. In reality, they were guarding assumptions. And while they focused inward on walls, protocols, endurance, the enemy's planning focused outward on timing, angles, and psychology. The attackers understood something the defenders did not. You don't need to defeat a fortress if you can make it irrelevant faster than it can respond. The stage was set. Confidence had calcified into expectation. Expectation had replaced vigilance, and somewhere beyond the range of the fortress guns, a plan was nearing completion, one that depended entirely on the defenders continuing to believe exactly what they believed now. While the fortress perfect defense, the attackers abandoned it entirely. Their planning did not revolve around walls, gates, or artillery ranges. In fact, those elements barely appeared on their operational maps. Instead, they studied routines, timelines, human behavior, the moments when certainty creates predictability. Their goal was not to overpower the fort. It was to bypass the logic that made the fort feel necessary in the first place. This shift in thinking marked a quiet but radical break from traditional warfare. Most of military planning begins with the enemy's strength and asks how to reduce it. This plan began with the enemy's confidence and asked how to exploit it. The attackers understood that a fortress is not just concrete and steel, it is a system, and systems fail not when they are attacked head-on, but when pressure is applied where they are not designed to respond. Instead of concentrating forces, the attackers dispersed them. Instead of broadcasting intent, they erased it. No, no troop movements large enough to trigger alarms. No rehearsals that could be detected. Silence became camouflage. Absence became misdirection. Every action was designed to reinforce the defender's belief that nothing unusual was happening. Behind that silence was intense preparation. Engineers, planners, and tacticians worked backward from a single question. How quickly can the defenders understand what is happening once it begins? The answer was unsettling. The fortress was optimized for resistance, not comprehension. Its systems assumed escalation, not disruption. Communication channels were layered, hierarchical, slow. Orders flowed downward. Information flowed upward. That structure worked brilliantly in prolonged engagements and catastrophically in sudden ones. The attackers focused on time compression. If they could collapse multiple stages of awareness into a single moment, response would lag behind reality. Alarms would trigger after damage was already done. Orders would be issued for situations that no longer existed. Defenders would react perfectly to the wrong problem. What made this strategy especially dangerous was its simplicity. There was no single super weapon, no dramatic breakthrough technology that screamed innovation. Instead, there was coordination, precision, and an understanding of how humans behave under shock. The attackers trained not just for execution, but for confusion, knowing that the first minutes after initiation would be decisive. They rehearsed transitions, not outcomes. What happens when power is lost, when visibility drops, when command is fragmented? They assumed defenders would hesitate, seek confirmation, wait for instructions. Every second of hesitation was built into the plan. Speed was not just an advantage, it was the weapon. Crucially, the attackers also understood restraint. This was not about maximum destruction. It was about maximum disorientation. Too much force too early would reveal intent. Too little would fail to overwhelm. The balance had to be exact. The fortress needed to remain psychologically intact right up until the moment it ceased to function. And so the final preparations unfolded unnoticed. Units moved under cover of routine logistics. Equipment was staged in places no one thought to monitor. Signals blended into background noise. To outside observers, and especially to those inside the fortress, nothing appeared out of place. This is the paradox of asymmetric thinking. The more unconventional the plan, the more invisible it becomes to conventional defense. The attackers were not hiding from the fortress. They were hiding inside its assumptions. And when the moment came, the defenders would realize too late that they had been preparing for a war that was never going to be fought. The breakthrough was not supposed to work. On paper, it violated everything the defenders trusted. It ignored the fortress's strongest features and targeted none of the points that traditional military logic said mattered. That was precisely why it succeeded. The attackers did not attempt to defeat the fort's defenses. They introduced a variable the defenses were never built to recognize. For decades, fortification design followed a predictable logic: reinforce walls, deepen bunkers, harden command centers, multiply redundancy. Every improvement assumed the threat would announce itself through force. Guns, bombs, pressure. What the defenders failed to grasp was that the most dangerous weapon was not destructive, it was disruptive. The tactic combined timing, physics, and psychology in a way that collapsed the reaction before resistance could even begin. Instead of striking where the fort was strongest, the attackers focused on the narrow window where systems transitioned from peace to attack. That moment, when alarms activate, when operators switch modes, when commanders seek confirmation, became the target. That innovation was not a single device, but a sequence. Each step triggered the next faster than human decision-making could keep up. One system failure cascaded into another. Backup protocols activated too late. Redundancies competed instead of compensating. The fortress was still structurally intact, but functionally blind. Inside, confusion spread instantly. Displays contradicted each other. Communications fragmented. Units received partial instructions that no longer aligned with reality. Officers trained for siege conditions suddenly faced a scenario with no precedent. There was no external enemy to shoot at, no breach to seal, just the sudden realization that the fort's core functions were slipping away faster than anyone could intervene. What made this tactic devastating was its invisibility until execution. By the time defenders understood that the attack had begun, the decisive phase was already over. The system was no longer responded to commands. It was reacting to damage. And reaction is always slower than intention. This is where doctrine collapsed. The fort had been designed to absorb punishment, not to interpret ambiguity. The attackers exploited that gap mercilessly. They did not need sustained pressure. They needed only minutes. Every second that passed worked in their favor, because the defender's strength, layered control, became an obstacle to speed. Witness accounts from similar collapses always describe the same sensation: disbelief. Defenders remember thinking, "This can't be the main attack." They waited for the real assault to begin. They assumed what they were experiencing was preliminary, a feint, a malfunction. That delay, measured in seconds, sealed the outcome. The fort did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it was optimized. Optimized for endurance, not agility. Optimized for certainty, not surprise. The attackers understood a brutal truth of modern warfare. When complexity meets speed, complexity loses. The first seconds did not look like an attack. That was the most lethal part. There was no thunder, no visible breach, no incoming fire to point at and name. What happened instead felt like a mistaken error layered on top of another error. Screens flickered. Indicators contradicted one another. A routine check suddenly failed, then failed again, and then stopped responding altogether. Operators assumed calibration issues. Commands assumed delays. No one assumed collapse. In fortified systems, confusion spreads faster than fear. Fear requires recognition of danger. Confusion thrives on ambiguity. The defenders experienced the latter. Orders were issued to investigate anomalies that no longer existed. Teams were dispatched to verify readings that had already become obsolete. Each action, correct in isolation, compounded the delay collectively. By the time anyone reached for escalation, the situation had already moved beyond escalation's usefulness. Inside the command spaces, the psychological shock was immediate but muted. Officers searched for confirmation rather than action. They waited for reports to align, for data to stabilize, for the picture to make sense. Training had taught them to avoid overreaction. Training had taught them to verify before committing. Those lessons, drilled for years, now worked against them. The attackers had planned for this exact hesitation. As systems degraded, the fortress entered a liminal state, neither under full attack nor fully operational. That in-between condition paralyzed deceit. If this wasn't a direct assault, deploying emergency protocols felt premature. If it was an assault, those same protocols were already arriving too late. The defenders hovered in uncertainty while the clock kept moving. Then came denial. Reports were reframed to fit expectations. A failure became a temporary interruption. A loss of control became a localized issue. Language softened reality because reality was too fast to accept. Soldiers on the ground sensed something was wrong, but without visible enemy contact, their instincts had nowhere to land. They waited. Waiting felt safe. Waiting felt disciplined. Waiting was fatal. The attackers counted on this human rhythm. They knew the defenders would not leap to worst-case conclusions. They knew responsibility would diffuse upward, each layer seeking confirmation from the next. In that gap between noticing and believing, the decisive work was already being done. The fort's internal coherence, its greatest strength, was unraveling. Witnesses later described the moment when realization finally struck. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, a sudden understanding that procedures no longer applied, that the mat no longer matched the terrain, that the fort was not being attacked in the way anyone had prepared for. By then, key functions were gone. Redundancies had tripped over each other. Command channels were fragmented beyond quick repair. What followed was not panic, but disbelief hardened into dread. The defenders were trained professionals, disciplined and capable. Yet they were facing a scenario with no script. And in war, the absence of a script is often more dangerous than the presence of an enemy. This is the cruel irony of surprise. The more sophisticated the defense, the more devastating the moment when it realizes it has been outpaced. The fortress still stood. The walls were intact. The guns remained unmanned, but the fight had already slipped past them, moving through seconds they would never get back. Collapse rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. It spreads quietly at first, then all at once. Inside the fortress, the failure did not arrive as an explosion, but as a chain reaction no one could stop once it began. One system slipped out of sync, forcing another to compensate. That compensation overloaded a third. Redundancies, designed to protect, began interfering with each other instead of providing relief. Communication fractured first. Orders left command centers already outdated by the time they arrived. Units acted on instructions that assumed systems still existed. When responses didn't come back, commanders assumed transmission failure, not structural breakdown. Every assumption bought the attackers more time. Then came isolation. Sections of the fortress became operational islands, each functioning according to its last confirmed status. Some units believed they were still fully combat ready. Others believed they were experiencing temporary outages. No one had a complete picture, and without a shared reality, coordination died. This is where the fortress began to die from the inside. Not because of enemy fire, but because its complexity turned against itself. The same layered safeguards that once made it resilient now slowed every attempt to adapt. Human operators became bottlenecks. Decisions stacked up, unresolved. Authority blurred. Initiative stalled. In critical areas, automated systems attempted to correct failures faster than humans could intervene. But automation, without context, amplified the damage. Systems shut down components they misidentified as compromised. Backup power rerouted incorrectly. Protective measures triggered against friendly infrastructure. The fortress was defending itself from ghosts. The defenders felt the shift before they understood it. The environment changed. Lights dimmed, doors locked or unlocked unexpectedly. Alarms sounded without clear cause. Each new anomaly chipped away at confidence. Soldiers stopped trusting instruments and started trusting instinct, but instinct had no training for this kind of threat. And then the cascade accelerated. Once a few core nodes failed simultaneously, recovery became mathematically impossible. The system no longer had enough functioning parts to stabilize itself. Every corrective action created new problems elsewhere. What had been designed as a fortress now behaved like a collapsing organism, systems cannibalizing each other in a desperate attempt to survive. This is the point where history turns brutal. The collapse is no longer reversible. There is no counterattack to launch, no wall to reinforce. The fight has moved beyond physical space and into time, and time belongs to whoever planned for speed. The attackers did not need to press further. The fortress was already neutralized, not destroyed in the traditional senjutsu, rendered irrelevant, its weapons unusable, its command blind, its defenders trapped inside a structure that no longer functioned as protection. And perhaps the most haunting realization came too late. Nothing inside the fort had technically failed on its own. Every component had done exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was that the design itself belonged to a world that no longer existed. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the fortress was no longer a battlefield. It was a relic in freefall. What had been designed to endure months of pressure unraveled in a span so short that later reports struggled to describe it accurately. Timelines blurred. Minutes felt unreal. Officers would later argue over whether certain systems failed before or after others, not because records were lost, but because human perception simply couldn't keep up. The defining feature of this moment was speed. Not raw violence, but compression. Events stacked on top of each other so tightly that cause and effect became indistinguishable. 1 second, the fortress existed as a functioning stronghold. The next, it existed only as a structure without purpose. That transition happened faster than doctrine could respond, faster than leadership could adapt, and faster than belief could dissolve. Inside, soldiers experienced a profound dislocation. Training told them how to fight for space, for ground, for time. None of that applied now. There was no advancing enemy, no visible front line, no opportunity to resist in any meaningful way. The fort had not been overwhelmed. It had been skipped. Witnesses described a surreal stillness as the realization spread. Weapons remained unused. Positions remained unmanned. The fortress didn't fall in flames. It emptied of relevance. Systems designed to coordinate defense were silent. The structure stood, but the fight had passed through it like a shadow. This is why the phrase vanished appears in historical accounts, not because the fort physically disappeared, but because its role did. In operational terms, it ceased to exist. Maps had to be redrawn, plans rewritten, assumptions erased. The defenders were still there, but what they were defending was gone. From the attacker's perspective, the outcome was almost anticlimactic. The plan did exactly what it was designed to do. Once the cascade reached critical mass, intervention was unnecessary. The fortress neutralized itself. Any additional force would have been redundant, even counterproductive. Victory had been achieved not through escalation, but through subtraction, and this is where military history becomes uncomfortable. Because moments like these challenge the romantic image of war, there was no heroic last stand, no dramatic breach, just a quiet, irreversible shift where preparation meant nothing and adaptation came too late. The fortress vanished not in fire, but in time. It disappeared between decisions, between assumptions, between the moment defenders believed they were still in control, and the moment they realized control was an illusion. The shock did not stay contained within the ruins of the fortress. It radiated outward almost immediately, rippling across the battlefield and into the minds of every unit connected to it. For allies who had relied on that fort as an anchor point, its sudden disappearance created a vacuum. Plans built around its presence collapsed in real time. Supply routes froze. Commanders hesitated. Entire formations paused, unsure whether they were still protected or suddenly exposed. Morale shifted faster than any physical movement. Troops who had advanced confidently under the assumption of an unbreakable stronghold behind them, now felt naked. The fortress had not just provided firepower, it had provided certainty. When that certainty vanished, fear filled the gap. Soldiers began questioning orders not because they lacked discipline, but because the mental map they relied on no longer matched reality. On the opposing side, the effect was just as powerful, but inverted. Units that had expected prolonged resistance suddenly found open space where pressure should have been. Momentum surged. What had been planned as a careful exploitation turned into rapid expansion. Decisions that normally required deliberation were made instinctively, fueled by disbelief and opportunity. Confidence snowballed. This is the psychological asymmetry that defines modern collapse. Physical destruction is slow. Psychological collapse is instantaneous. Once belief breaks, coordination follows. Once coordination fails, resistance becomes fragmented. The attackers did not need to overwhelm every unit. They only needed to remove the symbol that held those units together. Reports from nearby formations describe the same moment of realization. A single line in a transmission, a missing confirmation, a delayed response that never came. The fortress was supposed to answer it, always hot, when it didn't. Silence spoke louder than any explosion. Silence meant the impossible had already happened. From that moment on, the battle was no longer balanced. One side was improvising inside uncertainty. The other was exploiting clarity. Every minute widened the gap. Every decision favored the side that had already accepted the new reality. Resistance did not collapse everywhere at once, but it lost coherence. And coherence is what wins wars. What followed was not chaos, but inevitability. Positions were abandoned, not under fire, but under logic. Commanders recognized that holding ground tied to a vanished defense was pointless. Withdrawals began. Some were orderly, others were not. The psychological damage outpaced the physical one. This is how a single collapse reshapes an entire campaign, not through destruction, but through belief. The fortress had anchored strategy, morale, and expectation. Once it was gone, everything built around it became unstable, and that instability spread faster than any advancing army ever could. The disappearance of the fortress sent a signal far beyond the battlefield. Military observers, strategists, and intelligence services around the world took notice almost immediately, not because a fort had fallen that had happened before, but because how it fell defied the logic that had guided defensive doctrine for generations. The uncomfortable question spread quickly through war colleges and command staffs. If this could happen here, it could happen anywhere. For decades, military planning had revolved around the idea of layered defense, depth, redundancy, permanence. Fortresses were not just tactical assets. They were strategic statements. They told enemies where advance would stop, and told allies where safety began. The collapse shattered that assumption in a single stroke. It revealed that permanence itself had become a liability. Analysts began to realize that the decisive factor was no longer firepower or fortification, but adaptability under compression. The fortress had been strong but slow, coordinated but rigid, designed to survive pressure, not shock. That distinction rewrote how vulnerability was understood. The strongest defenses were now the most predictable ones. Doctrines that once emphasized holding ground started shifting toward controlling tempo. Militaries began asking different questions. How fast can we understand what's happening? How quickly can we reconfigure command? How many layers of Confirmation can we afford before action becomes meaningless? The answers were uncomfortable, because they implied that many existing systems were already obsolete. This moment exposed a deeper truth. War had quietly moved from space to time. Victory was no longer about who controlled territory, but who controlled reaction. Whoever forced the enemy into delay, even briefly, could dismantle systems that took years to build. The fortress collapse became a case study in this new reality. Some commanders resisted the lesson. They argued the event was unique, dependent on special conditions that couldn't be replicated. Others recognized the pattern immediately. They saw echoes in naval warfare, air defense, even logistics. Anywhere complexity met speed, collapse became possible. Anywhere certainty replaced curiosity, vulnerability grew. The most profound shift happened in how innovation was perceived. The collapse wasn't caused by a revolutionary weapon announced to the world. It was caused by thinking that refused to respect tradition. That realization terrified established institutions, because it meant that the next collapse might come from outside official channels, outside doctrine, outside expectation. From that point on, fortresses were no longer symbols of security. They became symbols of risk. Risk of rigidity, risk of overconfidence, risk of preparing perfectly for the wrong future. Military history did not discard defenses overnight, but it never looked at them the same way again. History rarely delivers lessons gently. It prefers brutality, compression, and humiliation. And the final lesson of this vanished fortress was not about walls, weapons, or even tactics. It was about illusion. The illusion that defense can remain static while war evolves. The illusion that strength, once proven, remains relevant forever. The illusion that preparation without adaptation is safety. What this collapse exposed was a recurring pattern hidden across centuries of warfare. Every era builds its ultimate defense. Every generation believes it has solved the problem of vulnerability, and every time the solution hardens into doctrine. Doctrine hardens into routine, and routine hardens into blindness. The fortress was not defeated by an enemy army. It was defeated by time catching up. The defenders did everything right according to the rules they knew. That is what makes this moment so unsettling. Training was solid. Engineering was sound. Leadership was competent. There was no dramatic betrayal, no obvious incompetence to blame. The failure lived in the gap between reality and expectation, a gap that widened silently until it swallowed everything. This is why collapses like this echo forward through history. They reappear in different forms, under different flags, with different technologies, but always with the same structure. A system optimized for control meets an opponent optimized for disruption. A defense built to endure meets an attack designed to bypass, and endurance loses to speed every time. The fortress did not fall screaming. It fell quietly, efficiently, and irreversibly. And that is the most dangerous kind of failure. The kind that looks impossible right up until the moment it's complete. By the time defenders understood what was happening, the war had already moved on without them. Modern militaries study this not because it is old, but because it is permanent. The tools change, the principle does not. Wherever defense becomes dogma, wherever certainty replaces curiosity, wherever adaptation slows, collapse is already rehearsing. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is this: the defenders were not foolish. They were confident for good reasons, which means the next fortress to vanish will likely be defended by people just as intelligent, just as trained, and just as convinced they are safe. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you already understand something most people never stop to consider. In war, what looks permanent is often the most fragile, and that understanding matters. If this video gave you a new way to think about military history, subscribe to the channel now. This is where we break down moments when certainty collapsed, doctrines failed, and a single idea changed everything. More stories like this are already waiting. Now leave a comment and be specific. Write the word you adopt if you believe flexibility decides wars, or time if you think speed is the ultimate weapon. I read every comment, and your response helps shape the next stories we tell. And if this video held your attention from beginning to end, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that deep, serious military history still has an audience, and it helps this channel reach people who are hungry for real insight, not surface-level explanations. One more thing, don't leave yet. The next video appearing on your screen dives into another moment where everyone believed the defense would hold until it didn't. Watch it now. While this story is still fresh in your mind,